Beyond the Fringe, Anomalies of Consciousness, Experience, and Scientific Research by Richard Thame. If you have not seen him speak, I've seen, gosh, I don't know how many talks you've done. Just a few. But, really amazing stuff. So, listen up.
Thank you. Thanks. It's so great to have a con like this in Milwaukee. We always get the short end of the short straw, I mean, I have had so many people, on the East Coast, and they say, you live in Milwaukee? Is that, what part of Minnesota is that in? And they get Minnesota and Wisconsin very confused because it's not as bad as Utah and Colorado and Wyoming, which are just big squares or octagons. But people confuse us. For nothing. And there's really something here. This is a terrific place. And I hand it to Mike and his cohorts who developed this last year and are growing it. And it's going to be the Midwestern Con, which will make ThoughtCon green with envy. It's just terrific to be here and only drive 20 minutes instead of fly 24 hours to Malaysia, as I was just invited to do. And I'm getting too old to do that. I said no. It just wasn't worth 24 hours. But 20 minutes is easy. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about and who I am. This is Foam. Foam is the title of a novel. I'll get the advertisements out of the way. It's a novel that I spent a lifetime learning enough to write, and it came out a year ago. And this poster is the cover of the third volume. It's 3 little volumes or 1 big volume. And what it suggests is that information and energy transfers in the universe. It transits. And it looks like they're individual entities, the bubbles, but their adjacency enables the possibility of the transfer of information and energy. And I was just talking to Nicole about where an idea like that comes from. Joe McMoneagle was one of the remote viewers for the NSA Stargate program, and he, like some of the other people in the remote viewing program, had some tremendous hits. How many of you do not know what the remote viewing program was about? Pretty much familiar with it? Okay. A guy named Ingo Swann walked into SRI some years ago, and he said he could affect things physically with his mind, and they gave him a series of tests, and that caused the gentleman who was doing the testing, his name was Hal Puthoff, to blow his mind because he actually affected things physically, and also he was able to detect the information present at a remote site. And the bottom line, to make it short, you can get 1 or 2 good books on it, and some bad books are available as well, is Hal took that program to NSA, and the NSA instituted a program in structured clairvoyance. And the premise of structured clairvoyance, they developed serious, very highly structured protocols for doing this work. It wasn't just going into a trance, but a trance-like state was also part of the game. But there were protocols to determine the effectiveness and the truthfulness of it. And they worked well. And I've talked to both Hal over the years, and I've talked to other people at CIA who brought the program in there. And theoretically, the program was ended, which is a cover story. It's not the same as it was, but it's still going on in some quarters of the intelligence community. To give you an example of what you can detect with remote viewing, Joe McMoneagle detected what looks like a new boomer, a new big nuclear submarine, larger than anything the Russians had developed. And it's right brain, left brain stuff. You have to get the impressions, and you use drawing on the right side of the brain to manifest the impressions without interpretation or logical analysis. And you only logically analyze them after you've put the impressions in an embodied form, like a drawing. And it was a big thing, and he drew the apparatus around it, and he drew the context that he detected existed. And people said it couldn't exist because, while it was a very, very large submarine, it was being built, according to his remote viewing, on the land. And you never built a submarine like that on the land. You built it near the water so you could launch it. And the wonderful end of the story is that when that submarine was completed, they detected through satellite imagery the building of a canal from that site to the water and the bringing of the submarine through that canal into the water, exactly as he had postulated. There are a few other startling stories like that, but the point that it makes, that Joe said to me, he had learned after years of doing this, was that information is streaming through the universe in a way that enables sentient, intelligent beings like ourselves to capture, depending on what he called, the first volume of Foam, lobes and folds, the complexity and number of the lobes and folds in your brain. Now, it wasn't long ago that we wondered, are there other planets out there? And now we've detected with our primitive apparatuses thousands of extrasolar planets. We know that the universe is teeming with life, and that we are relatively Johnny-come-latelys to the party, just barely up from the swamp, which ought to give us some humility. With our civilization the way it is, only 10 or 12,000 years old, based on agriculture and animal husbandry, which started in Anatolia, province of Greece, only 10 or 12,000 years ago. It's a blink. So the humility also attends the fact that the astonishing things we discover and know usually approach our framework or our frame of knowledge as an anomaly. An anomaly is that which doesn't fit. And our brains have developed ways, just like our bodies, with very complex, wonderful immune systems, to attack ideas that threaten the integrity of the whole. And an anomaly that doesn't fit threatens the integrity of the whole. So it must be at first rejected. And yet, as we just heard from the keynoter, I thought it was terrific talk about how kids can be taught, or not even taught, but innately have the ability to look for new ways of making things happen. Kids have a propensity for innovation, and this is what hacking is. This is also what science is. Scientists and hackers share obsession and daring as traits that they have to have. You have to be obsessive. You have to be daring, you have to be bold, and you have to just not quit. And the traits that you enumerated, persistence and so on, fit that exactly. So we are built not to be hackers, and that's why the hackers I've gotten to know over many years are a niche. I've spoken at DEF CON for 21 straight years now, and I often say that it's the home to which I love to go, the psychic home, because it's one of the only places that I can go where you don't have to explain anything, where everybody gets it, where everybody knows who we are and what it is we're doing there. Foam seemed to me an appropriate image for the non-local consciousness that exists in the universe, that is one of the sources of the innovative and imaginative ideas that simply seem to ping in our minds. And that's why this little poster, these are available free downstairs if you like them. Pick one up. It's the cover of the third volume of Foam. And to me, the illustrator, Duncan Long, captured my stance before the universe, and I think some of yours. We stand in awe and wonder before the complexity of the universe. And in UFO lore, which I don't want to get into too much here, but there are wonderful stories in UFO lore, and one of them is during an encounter a person said he had with an alien being, and he said, "Are you the watchman?" The alien said, "Are you the watchman over this place?" to the policeman. And he said, "Yes," to which the alien theoretically responded, "Watchman, one day you will see the universe." Now, that is the way a civilization that has been to so many more places than we can dream or imagine might communicate to us the edge of wonder, whether it's a true story or not, the edge of wonder that explodes our minds. There are other sources of it, and I'm going to get the ad out of the way. What I was just talking to Nicole about was the 3 books I'm showing you are illustrations of how not only the young, but the old, like myself, can continue to stay alive to the anomalies that transform your understanding of what's real and initiate the pursuit of a different paradigm or model of reality, which subsequently comes to be. Mind Games is a collection of short stories I wrote, and I returned to writing fiction when I was working with people at NSA on ethical issues after 9/11. We had no effectiveness whatsoever, but we had great conversations over 3 or 4 years off-site about ways to implement ethical constraints on some of the things that were going down in the intelligence community after 9/11. And one of the people, a deputy director of NSA, said, you know, you can't ever discuss, Richard, the things we talk about here, of course, unless you start writing fiction. Fiction is now the only way you can tell the truth. And so since then I've written 35 short stories, and a publisher chose 19 of them for collection of Mind Games. Some are about hackers, some are about alien civilizations. They're all about anomalous situations that we encounter. And I have also done a talk at DEF CON called Fiction is the Only Way You Can Tell the Truth, in which I show how the hyper-real environment in which we live requires discernment of the highest and most subtle sort, as we all know now post-Trump, merely to determine what it is that's true and not true. Last but not least, this is a great big book. I'll show you how big it is. Big. 600 pages, 1,000 footnotes. A team of us, 5 of us, worked on this for, not 5 of us, 10 of us worked on this for 5 years, on top of 50 years of research by people who have unearthed more documents from the government than you can imagine exist. Barry Greenwood, whose name is on there, currently has a collection of about 250,000 documents. Every footnote in this book points to a government document that we have unearthed over half a century, or to other primary sources. So there's nothing speculative in the book, and what we illuminate with it is simply how the government responded from the 40s to the 80s to the anomalous phenomena which it knew very much was real. And how do you respond to a phenomena that you know is real, to something anomalous? Well, here's the way General Nathan Twining responded to it in 1947. He said, the phenomenon is real. It's not visionary or fictional. And he talks about the size and operating characteristics, extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, particularly in roll action, which must be considered evasive when sighted by friendly aircraft and radar. In other words, intelligent entities, either remotely, robotically, or presently. Belief in the possibility that they're controlled manually, automatically, or remotely. And then he described what they look like and how they fly in formation. That's what an open-minded human being does with anomalies. And Richard Feynman, the great physicist, said that the important thing in science is an anomaly that is also a fact. It has to be both. It has to be not illusory or fictitious. It has to be a fact, and it has to be anomalous. Because if it challenges the model of reality which you currently use to understand what is happening around you, then if you pursue it, as Twining did, and as some others did before 1953, the CIA and the Air Force and Navy adopted a different strategy to deal with the phenomena, which was to downplay it and ridicule and debunk, which has been very effective for many years and continues to this day. This is not conspiracy theory. We have go to YouTube and look at my talk on the book, UFOs and Government, and you'll see the documentation for that. We have the documents. But if you are open-minded, then it leads to an entirely different way of understanding what's real. And of course, there's a possibility that one of the subtexts of the policies that were enumerated in 1953 and then adopted was so that reverse engineering, as best we could do it, through inference from the characteristics described by General Twining in 1947, might lead to new breakthrough discoveries in propulsion systems, metal alloys, material science, communications, i.e. fiber optics, discrete forms of light, which seemed solid when they were integrated in a different way. Some think we understood new things were possible on the simple basis of what we observed was possible, but it was necessary to have a good, effective cover story to manage it appropriately for a variety of national security reasons which have persisted through the years. The FBI asked me to do a talk on the book in order to illuminate structures of cover and deception and how effectively they can be applied. So this is not made-up stuff. None of this is made-up stuff. So those 3 books will be available, of course, since I'm not being paid. He said, well, you can sell books if somebody wants one. And as an incentive, if anybody buys all 3 books, the first person to do so gets this DEF CON 18 Ninja Badge Kit complete, absolutely free, as the markers say on the infomercial. I will give you that as well. Okay. Now, I'm going to try to talk about 2 different domains in terms of anomalies and how they challenge us. One is the domain of scientific knowledge and our understanding of what's real. The other is identity. Because you hear a lot about privacy these days because it's being challenged. Well, it's not being challenged. It's being totally wiped out. There is no such thing as privacy, and I'll say something more specific about that in a few minutes. I did a talk in Victoria for the Ministers of Privacy from Canada called When Privacy Goes Poof, Why It's Gone and Never Coming Back. And the Minister of Privacy said, one can only hope that this challenging keynote was, of course, wrong. Illustrating the point I had made earlier in the speech that Nietzsche said about new ideas, which is when something challenges your understanding, you feel fearful. And you will accept any explanation, he said, which ameliorates the fear, regardless of its relevance to the truth. But you will call it the truth because you need to have that ameliorating hypothesis to recall the familiar and reinforce the past rather than allow the facts of the future pull you forward into the future, which the anomaly and the new paradigm which it suggests, and which is going to be predicated upon it, suggests is possible. So this is about thinking that way. And this is serious stuff. Alfred White Northhead said major advances in civilization are processes that all but wreck the societies in which they occur. This is true of identity as well. You see, our identities are being fundamentally transformed, first by the technical revolution with which you are so familiar, but those of you who are young don't live on the Terminator anymore. The Terminator on the moon was light on one side, dark on the other, and where the light and the dark hit, you can see the mountains and the rills and the definition. But where it's white, it's all whited out, and where it's dark, it's all dark. So it's only when there's a transition from one paradigm to another that we suddenly can see clearly, looking back, what the old paradigm used to be, now in light of and related to what the new paradigm is that is coming to be. And then when you are born into that new paradigm, it's simply reality. It's what you accept from the age of 8 or 10 as the foundational reality on which you build so much of your future life. So things that I heard as a child would sound comical now. My mother used to say, "Shh, I'm going to make a long distance call." Shh, because it was a very big deal to make a long distance call. Now there is no such thing as a long distance call. There is only a call, but there's not even a call anymore because it was only about 20 years ago, I started doing this 23 years ago, that we spoke of what we called the Internet. And young people now, habituated to and socialized by the new structures of technology that pervade everything, don't speak of going on the Internet any more than we speak of going onto the phone system to make a long-distance call, or that we speak when we plug some appliance into a socket of going onto the grid. We don't say, "Shh," when you plug in a toaster. "I'm going onto the grid now." Quiet. Well, in the same way, young people do not say, "I'm going on to the Internet." The Internet, it's not that we change paradigms. The paradigm changes us, absorbs us, in this case, from a hierarchical structure into a distributed structure, which means our identity itself is like being a node in a network where power is exercised completely differently than in hierarchical structures alone. So young people just get it. The wonderful slides we saw in the keynote. Maybe if I pound on this long enough, maybe if I do this, in the old days, we had the first color TV. First color TV on my block when I was a kid. My mother won it in a raffle. It was about the size of a refrigerator. You know what a refrigerator is, right? It's a node in the Internet of Things is what it is. And then it had a little screen, about 5-inch screen, and I grew up in an apartment building in Chicago, in Berry and Sheridan, 67 apartments. There was a whole community of kids, and you didn't have color TV all the time. You had like 3 programs a week. And when Sid Caesar's Show of Shows was going to be on in color, we set up folding chairs, and all the kids in the building came and sat there and watched. And as I crouched at what we called tone and hue, these 2 dials that you use to get the flesh looking less green and more pink, suddenly it flashed the yellow letters of the Show of Shows, and everybody burst spontaneously into applause. Okay, that's how old I am. That is how old I am. So, these anomalies move from the edge to the center. They move from the edge to the center. What do I mean by that? Well, if you were in England in the late 1700s, a while ago, and you asked an Englishman, a banker, where's the center of the world? It's right here. The City of London, the Bank of England, this is the center. And you'd say, where are the outlying lands? And he said, well, over there in the colonies, maybe Australia or the States or Canada. But he was wrong, because the center had already shifted to the edge. The edge was the colonies, and the colonies were the new center. And that's what ushered in, subsequently, the American century. Today, new ideas, new realities move from the edge to the center faster and faster and faster. And so you have to be open. You have to build an openness to heresy into your very sacred paradigm, because heresy is the doorway or portal into the new paradigm, which is arriving faster and faster as those anomalous facts move from the edge to the center. George Bernard Shaw put it this way: all great truths begin as blasphemy. So when you believe a consensual reality, you are often going to be thought crazy. I have wonderful stories about how many times I have been called crazy. And it turned out that I wasn't so crazy after all. When I first began writing about the technical transformation of society and religious structures, academic journals sent the essays back, and in the margins it said, he must be mad. Who does he think he is? This is nonsense. The same journals published it 10 years later as cutting edge, bleeding edge, because the contextual understanding of who we were and what was happening had so shifted that now it began to make sense, but at first it didn't make sense. So when Robert Galvin, who was a big mover at Motorola when it was in its great heyday and doing extraordinary breakthrough activities, he was asked what ideas were the real breakthrough ideas that made the substantive difference from time to time at Motorola. And he said every idea that was a breakthrough idea began its journey as a position of one person. One person saw it, and they said it, and no one else heard it. In other words, it was as if you said nothing at all. It's as if I said, well, I have had an encounter with an extraterrestrial. That's interesting. And what are you having for lunch? It goes by. No one hears it. But if it's repeated again and again, people hear it, but they laugh at it and reject it because it doesn't fit the model of reality in which they live and move and have their very being. And so if it keeps being repeated, then you get angry at it, and then you reject it and try to depose it and try to attack the person who's saying it and do character analysis of them in a slanderous way. And then it arrives, as you know, at the last position, which is not only does everybody believe it, but everybody will insist that they've always believed it all along. He said the corollary to that a minority opinion was the truth about every breakthrough idea, is that if they went into a meeting and had a really challenging, perplexing problem presented, and everybody agreed on a solution, it was always wrong. Every time, he said, it was always wrong. And if you think about how paradigms or models work, you can see why that would be. If all of you are living within the model or paradigm of the past, based on past experience and the hypotheses and consensual realities that have emerged from it, and a challenge comes in, and you interpret it only in light of the context of the past, then it's going to be wrong. It's going to be wrong because the new reality that you can't see is already present in its outlines and form. So like that Englishman who said, this is the center and missed the colonies, if you ask people not long ago how it's moved so fast in my own lifetime, if you ask people not long ago, where is the center of intellectual production? Where's the center of economic production? Where's the center of everything? People would say right here, the earth. The earth is the center. And already the earth is over as the foundational reality of what's to come. We need new language to describe the emergent properties of what we're discovering. Space, which sounds like empty space, isn't a good name for everything besides us. You know, the Greeks called barbarians everybody who wasn't a Greek. And we call space, emptiness, everything that isn't Earth. But already we know in our primitive ways that there are thousands of planets, and some of us suspect and have even been told that we know as a fact that there are inhabited planets far beyond ours. And as I said, if you think about how the solar system evolved and how our galaxy evolved, we're way out, about 2/3 of the way out in a spiral arm, and other civilizations would have evolved much earlier. Well, if you can think of where we were just 10,000 years ago or 100 years ago, you take for granted electric lights. 150 years ago, they didn't even exist. That's how new electricity and the wiring of the grid has been for us. So we're going through a phase change of human identity. That one's free. Well, actually, they're all free, but that one's even more free. We're going through a phase change of human identity. Matt Blaze, very brilliant guy, said he was talking about security, and he said the major problem in security is the definition of the problem, and the definition of the problem is usually wrong. The same is true for identity. The real problem in our conversations about privacy and identity is the definition of privacy and the definition of identity. And they're generally wrong. They're not who we have already become, but for which we do not have the language to say clearly that we are that. What we think we are. What we can do, therefore, because how you hold yourself as a possibility for action is based on the reality which you believe you inhabit, and therefore it's the leverage or fulcrum which you will use to try to manipulate the world the scientific way we heard discussed in the delightful keynote. Only by engaging fully with the transformational properties of technologies of information and communication and space travel and robotics and biotech and nanotech and material science, only then can we begin to discover who we are. And I was told long ago that the amount of information as a result of the technological transformation of information and communication, the production of knowledge was exceeding the ability of anybody, however expert they were in their domain, of mastering. In other words, nobody could read everything being published in their domain of expertise. Now, that's not going to be a situation that is going to be tolerated very long. And what is it that's happening now? Just read, for example, I got in the mail today the IBM annual report, and look at what they're doing with Watson, and what we are doing not only at IBM and Watson but other places with AI is developing systems of AI, not to take us over in an Isaac Asimov science fiction sort of way, but to parse information so fast that it can then output new and innovative solutions to problems we didn't even know how to identify because we couldn't see the patterns fast enough. So inevitably, a response and emergent property of human beings being unable to think with mastery about their own domains of expertise is now being rebalanced by the evolution of AI, which gives us solutions to problems we hadn't identified, because the machines can read thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of articles simultaneously and look for patterns that suggest, for example, as Watson did with a cancer cure, 3 different novel treatments that no medical person had even been able to formulate because they didn't think that way. See, we need a new language to begin to articulate what it is we're experiencing, grasp the nature of the very context in which we live. And this is going to be a great divide. This is even greater divide than the economic disparities between the rich and the poor. There are going to be the mentally rich, the mentally capable of hacking, and the poor who take refuge in consensual realities that reassure them that the past is the past and will always stay the present and will be the future, even though, well, it drives us crazy to hear these things articulated, but you know what people do. They do choose, as Nietzsche said, that which comforts them and ameliorates fear. And we instead have to confront the fear. Fritz Perls, great psychologist, said, excitement is anxiety plus oxygen. And watching a hacker work, or being a hacker at work, as you feel yourself pumped up by the hint, the intimation that there's some new way to approach this, and it begins to emerge on the edges of your thinking, and then you pursue it, not knowing if it will work. Like Edison said, of every filament that failed, that's one I know now won't work, until he got to the 100th filament and we had light bulbs. Hacking is a absolute study in aesthetic beauty, to watch a human mind locked in and in trance and one with the machine, or at least loving the machine. I have a DEF CON t-shirt that I love. It says in the back, the woman is saying, "My God, I didn't know he was in love with a machine." And that was from a DEF CON long ago. So, the weakest link in discussions of security, privacy, identity is the definition, and the definition is not what we think. So this has created a whole variety of new experiences. I have a son. He's in his 40s now. Checking the time. He's in his 40s. Back when he was graduating from Northwestern, not far away, they announced at the graduation the major field of study of the people coming up for their diploma. And they said all those in history and all those in literature and so on. And then they said, we have one ad hoc major. And everybody laughed. They laughed because ad hoc major didn't make sense to them. You had a definite, well-defined category of domain of understanding. Excuse me. Yeah, Smirnoff is all right. They thought history was history and that's all it was, and math was math and that's all it was. But what my son had done was take a look at the things he loved to do. I got him an Apple II when he was 12, and he opened it and started programming it, and he never looked back. He had combined studies from math and cognitive psych and philosophy and AI and computer science. And he integrated them into a major he called symbolic system studies, which is now a major. He was a prototype of what was inevitably to come. In other words, as the boundaries around not only countries and nation states and individual entities go down and become porous and amorphous, but the boundaries around everything are going down, including domains of knowledge and understanding. And what he discovered was that only in a cross-disciplinary way can I begin to understand what these different areas of expertise contribute to a new area of expertise that is emerging. In other words, originality, again going back to Nietzsche, what is it? To see something that has no name as yet, and hence cannot be mentioned, although it stares us in the face. The way human beings are, it takes a name to make something visible. Those with originality have for the most part been those who have also assigned new names. And then people get a hold of the name as if they have a handle on something real, and then it becomes part of their paradigm, and we move forward. For example, when in the 1920s, after World War I, had demonstrated the power of air power, we began flying here and there, and we were delivering mail by the government, and periodically people would hop on the plane and ride with the mail, and they were daring souls in this new technology, and they called them aeronauts. And the government decided they needed more aeronauts to ride on planes and pay for it to defray the cost of flying those expensive machines from one place to another. But they needed a new name. They couldn't call them aeronauts. Well, we have astronauts. right? But most of us don't think of ourselves yet as capable of being an astronaut and going to space. In the same way, most human beings in the 1920s couldn't think of themselves as riding airplanes. So they needed to give it a name that people could recognize and put themselves into that name and then take it back as part of their identity. And so what was the name they changed aeronaut to? Anyone? Airplane passenger. They said, let's call them passengers. And how many people are airplane passengers? Everybody. But the name is what made it available. So, this is becoming a phenomenon that's happening faster and faster. These new names need to be assigned in a meaningful way that integrates with enough of our other knowledge to be able to be, in a cross-disciplinary way, understood in a way that gives us power. In 2004, the first president of MIT, who was not just a woman, but had a background in biology, was hired as president of MIT. First time it wasn't an engineer. She gave a wonderful address that's now over a decade old on cross-disciplinary learning and why it was essential and necessary for all students to master that discipline more than any other. And the fact that she came from bio should have been a signal that the technology of information communication was now a platform on which these other domains were resting and also accelerating the speed at which they worked. And that's why I started doing talks some years ago on biohacking, and did talk to people at CIA who were doing extraordinary, innovative, and sometimes scary things with neuroscience, because biohacking is the name of the game. Hacking our identity from the inside out. And I don't have to go into that. There's another talk online that I've done about that, but you know what I mean. What CRISPR, wonderful new technology, enables us to do with gene manipulation that is going to enable us to do all sorts of things. Well, in this country, we have constraints, ethical and legal, that prevent us from doing certain kinds of studies. In other parts of the world, they don't. They don't. So everything that can be done is going to be done. I'll give you an example. There are people now talking about head transplants. That's one monkey giving a head to another. But they mean it. They mean it. Now, here is a mouse, white head. And here is what it looked like after the head transplant. It's a real picture, real mouse. Which is the mouse, the head or the body? Now, we have advanced so much that we were able to discern what you would call mouse thoughts. I mean, the neurological pattern in the brain of this head when it discovered itself on a new body. Would you like to see what we found out? This is what it was thinking. Right? Okay. So, all right. That's the only non-true story in the speech. But it's what a lot of us are thinking a lot of the time as a result of finding ourselves with our head processing information that seems to be coming from a different body. And that's why the proper attitude is awe and wonder rather than fear and shrinking. Change causes fear. It causes rigidity. It causes isolation. And it's interesting to me over a lifetime to notice that the antidotes to fear and rigidity and isolation are mutuality, feedback, and accountability. And as I start working with businesses 20 years ago in a different way, I realized that every successful organizational structure has all three things built in. Mutuality, cooperative learning structures, accountability to agreed upon goals and visions, and a fluidity and interactivity that is based on feedback inside the system, parts to parts, and to the other parts outside the system. And when you look at the human being, you realize we've always known we are cells in a body, as I was suggesting at the start, but we emphasize the cellness, our individuality. Now we emphasize bodiness. We know we are part of a whole in which information energy moves, always transforming the system once the systems connect with other systems, and the ability to see that at the highest level of abstraction is where your power lies and what you are enabled to do with it by virtue of your insight. Let me give you some examples about that. Because this relates to identity and privacy. You probably know that the concept of privacy is a relative latecomer on the human cultural scene. Back in the day, that is in 1400, when you lived all winter with your animals in a castle, which smelled really bad by the time spring came. Here's a little thing a lot of people don't know. Do you know why we have June weddings? Seriously. Because that's when the flowers were in sufficient bloom to cover the stench of the people getting married, and all of the attendant people at the wedding. You live with a cow and a donkey and a horse inside one room for a winter and see how you smell. All right, so, but that's not what I was talking about. I was talking about privacy as a new thing. You didn't have any privacy there. It wasn't even a thought that I need my own room. Like an American child feels like it's going to call the social worker, right? If you abuse it by not letting it have the internet all the time. And I remember when my daughter, typical North Shore and Milwaukee child, had her own bedroom and was filled with appliances and appurtenances and lotions, potions, and creams. I mean, God, everything. And she said the one thing she wanted was a microwave so she could cook for herself and leave the dishes outside the door for us to take care of. So she would never have to come out and interact with such a horrible family. Those of you who have teenagers recognize the phase. It passes, but that's the way it was. Okay, so individuality was not a new thing. It was a new thing as the changes began to take place in society, and the major engine of those changes was the printing press. The printing press was the transformational engine of the day back in the 1400s, late 1400s. The same way what we called the Internet has been the digital technologies, have been the transformation of our own day. I'm running through this to try to find something I can quote accurately. The printing press was the foundation of the Reformation, the scientific revolution, religious transformation, transformation of knowledge, transformation of nation states into entities with large enough boundary around them to organize the complexity resulting from the speed of the flow of information into and out of and through the system. So you got that? The boundary you need around an organizational structure or any entity has to be one that is graspable and which manages the complexity reached by the speed of the flow of information into and out of that system. Well, simultaneously with the emergence of the printing press came things like rights. There was no such thing as intellectual property or intellectual property rights. There was no such thing as human rights, and there was no such thing as civil rights until much later, individuals were discovered to have them. But I want to stop for a moment and look at the word individual. How many of you have seen a Shakespeare play recently? Anybody? Yeah, it figures. Okay. Well, how many of you know, all right, let's back up. How many of you know who Shakespeare was? Okay, that's good. Well, I once referred to Hal in a speech at DEF CON, and one of the youngsters came up and said, "Who is Hal?" Thinking everybody knew the robotic Hal. And not long ago at O'Reilly Security Conference in New York in the fall, I quoted Chinatown, one of my favorite movies. It's Chinatown, Jake. It's Chinatown. And one of the people putting on the conference said, most of those people have never seen that movie. Well, I love it, she said, but a lot of people don't know what that means. And then you think, yeah, that was the 70s. That was many, many decades ago. And a lot of people don't know the 70s was the golden age of real good Hollywood films. But that's a whole other story. Well, I bring up Shakespeare because there's about 25% of the words, if you do go to a Shakespeare play, you think you will understand Elizabethan English. This is not Chaucer in Middle English. This is not Beowulf in Old English. This is Elizabethan English, and you think you understand it pretty well, but about 25% of the words do not mean what you think they mean. Their meanings have changed. Language is fluid and dynamic and organic. And Shakespeare used the word individual, but what he meant by it was indivisible. It was a describing word of a quality of indivisibility, of unitariness, of unity on the part of an object or attribute. It wasn't for another couple of 100 years, using the OED to trace the meaning of the word in a word study, that we discovered that the word individual meant a human being. An individual, as we think of ourselves as individuals in a political and moral structure, which requires that individual to have a status that's ontological, that is real, that is very, very recent. And rights accrued to individuals, and only an individual could have privacy, which was a boundary around the information being radiated by the life of the human being. Well, obviously, if you think about what hacking has done, what computers have done, what the digital world has done, is an individual in that sense no longer exists in that way. Why is an ad hoc major replacing that domain? Why is transnational economic and political power replacing nation states as the source of power and influence in all of our lives? Because the boundary around those definitions of identity has morphed, and it no longer means what it means. We are corporate structures. We are cells in a body, but we feel the cellness in the bodiness more than ever because we're aware of all the systems as a body, hormones, the biome, which has more DNA in it, many of you know, than our DNA, and therefore has more of a profound effect on our health and well-being. We are just discovering than we ever knew. So I talked about the level of abstraction. What is data analytics? What is it but the extraction of points of data from behaving entities, including human beings, and then the integration of those points of data in patterns of understanding which previously did not exist, and which the individual entity radiating them did not know existed and does not know existed. So those who study us at the level of meta-knowledge and metadata know us better than we know ourselves. Now, this is something that has come to be as an axiomatic truth about marketing and advertising and political work and so on, that those who manage metadata in such a way as to understand what our choices have meant know us better and can predict us better than we know ourselves and can predict our own behavior. So when they first started doing this using just cell phones at Harvard, they discovered that you could tell when two people were having a political conversation on the basis of the pattern of the relationship as evidenced by their communication, not the content of the communication. They knew when people were getting sick, when an epidemic was going through the campus, before anybody knew they were sick or felt the symptoms themselves. The behavior was reflected in the points of data which, as one said doing those studies, they're not human beings to us. They're little dots on a screen that move around and occasionally touch one another. So when you're looking at that level of abstraction, you see that real identity, based on the level of abstraction which you can see, is another one of these great gulf jumping points, because people who live here as if we are who we thought we were in the 20th century don't get that they're not. And they don't get that privacy, of course, is over, because the definition of privacy itself has been torn asunder. It can't exist when we, by our participation in a society such as ours, radiate data points all the time, which are captured, and now thanks to the executive decision of the new regime, can be sold and bought and sold and aggregated in even more sophisticated and clever and economically feasible ways for the rich. The level of abstraction determines your identity. Really, not just theoretically, but really. And this may sound abstract to some, but not to people who do analytics or who analyze metadata. So, is privacy a human right? Well, if there was such a thing as a human right, it might be, but the definition of rights is going down too. Boundaries have gone down in meaningful ways. You can speak about the nation state of America. When I do this talk in Canada, you can speak about the nation state of Canada. but you cannot describe the economics or social structures or entertainment media worlds which frame the mind of American society, or the cognitive artifact called America in which we live, as if it can be distinguished from those of the rest of the world. Information transiting all borders disappears the borders. So, non-local consciousness is what we have to confront as a metaphorical and theoretical model for understanding what the transit of information everywhere and always that never quits is doing to who we think we are. An elementary particle, said a physicist, Henry Pierce Japp, is not an independently existing and unanalyzable entity. It is in essence a set of relationships that reach out and to other things. I talked to Edgar Mitchell before he died. He was Apollo 14 astronaut, and he walked on the moon, and he had a life-changing experience coming back from the moon. He said for 3 days, he was in and out and in and out and in and out of an altered state. And when he was in, what he suddenly saw was the unity of all things. That everything was connected to everything else, including us, of course, and that the illusory self was just that, an illusion, as so many religions have claimed. And we are not separate from one another. We are inseparable parts of a single universe which has consciousness as its structural foundation prior to and post to our limited individual existence. For 3 days he went in and out of that state, and he came back and he said, my life will never be the same again. And he spent the rest of his life trying to communicate to people what he had seen, what he had experienced, what he had felt coming back from the moon. He's a wonderful guy. He came to the conclusion that the amazing thing is not that we see ourselves periodically that way, as interrelated in that deep and foundational way, but that we ever see ourselves as separate. That we have evolved so as to think of ourselves as separate. Oh my God, the girl says in the back of that t-shirt, he's in love with a machine. A hacker who fuses symbiotically with the machine, which becomes an essential aspect of themselves, is more than in love with the machine. They are in a symbiotic relationship with a not conscious but intelligent entity that is fueling and feeding their ability to go farther and surpass all those who cannot engage with the machine. I'll give you a trivial example. Years ago, I was writing about this stuff way back, late 80s, early 90s, and Wired magazine came along, and I proposed an article for them in the early days, outlining where the internet was going to lead society. And they took, I guess it was a 5,000-word article. They used 500, being Wired, but that was good. And I said, can I use these other 4,500 words any way I want? I said, yeah, write another article or use them any way you want. Now, this is the thing. I used to teach English literature back in my 20s. I taught English literature at the University of Illinois. So I kind of knew how text works. And the world in which you wrote stories and sent them out and wrote articles and sent them out was defined by text. In other words, there was a book called Writer's Market, and it contained North American markets. And literally, that was the paradigm or model you could not but live in because there was no other model. And here I am using text in that old paradigm, writing for Wired about where the internet is going to lead people, and I'm thinking, where can I send the rest of these words to publish them? Since there was nothing like Wired anywhere in America. And that's when the light bulb went on. Thank God for light bulbs. And I said to myself, duh, don't just write about the internet, use the internet. That was brand new then. My website was one of the ones USA Today called a website of the week. That's how few there were. They picked 5 a week to spotlight. And so I got on the internet and found magazines in England, in South Africa, in Australia, in Canada, and began writing for those places all over the world. And suddenly, by engaging with the technology itself is my point. I was shown that which I could not see inside the old paradigm because we can't. And once I could be drawn by the new paradigm into it, by having the courage and will to engage with it, then I became a global figure. That's not a hotshot thing. Everybody these days is a global figure. I was just early. And once you're a global figure, I began writing a column called Islands in the Clickstream, and it was going to 60 countries in a couple of years and to a lot of subscribers. And suddenly that created a platform of credibility on which a speaking career could be based. If I had not been willing to use the internet to expand my horizons dramatically in the way that only the technology itself could disclose, then that never would have happened. So when we have the courage to hack our bodies, or hack our minds, or hack the economic structure, we are allowing ourselves to be drawn into a new paradigm. Once upon a time, I used to be, let's see what time it is. I'm almost done. I'll make this a concluding story, because it's like many things, it can conclude it sensibly. I used to be an Episcopal clergyman. That was a long time ago. I was in the ministry for 16 years, loved it, learned a lot, was taught a lot, and I was invited to participate in a hotshot conference called New Paradigms for Clergy Leadership. It was a 3-year conference, and they brought us together for 10 days, brought in Silicon Valley people to talk about all the things they were doing so that we could adapt those structures for the paradigms of the Episcopal Church, and rethink it. So we're going to come up with new paradigms. Most of the people in that room were white males. Most of them were in their 40s, 50s, typically, you know. And they were sitting there second year buzzing about how can we change the paradigm when a light bulb went on. And I said, I just realized what we have to do to change the paradigm. And they said, what? And I said, we have to leave. It got real quiet. And then about 10 seconds later, everybody began talking again as if I had never said anything. And it took a woman to come up at the break, a woman who was a staff, B, a woman, to sit there on the edge and watch what was happening and say, when you speak from that depth of reality, they cannot hear you. But I could not ever forget what I heard myself say. I had to prepare it properly so that I left in the way I wanted to. But for 23 and a half years, after leaving the ordained ministry, instead of taking the hotshot jobs they were offering, I've been able to explore this world in a way that never would have been possible had I stayed within that paradigm. Instead, I've transcended the structures. Well, I don't need to go into religious talk. Leaving the old paradigm instantiates the new paradigm. Because what I saw was that the hotshot leaders were Gorbachev. They were trying to both preserve the revolution and lead a revolution, and you can't do both. And there was no way, having reached leadership positions in the church or any organization, that you cannot have not internalized the structures by which you have reached those levels. And you have become that. As Timothy Leary said, you never get the truth from the company memo. Never. Your invasion of the body snatchers. You open your mouth and people think it's you, but it's wah, 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 wah. You are articulating the organizational culture's point of view and not your own. And so, leaving the old paradigm with the courage to know that you don't know what the new paradigm is going to bring is what a hacker does all the time. It's what a good hacker does. It's really what your kids are about, which is great. And it's what this conference is about. And on that note, I will say, do I have time for one question or two? And I'll be downstairs with these magnificent books discounted at an incredible rate. But if you, how much? The Mind Games is 20 instead of 30. The Foam is, in 3 volumes or 1, is 25 instead of 30. The UFO Today's, UFO and Government I have to sell for what the publisher requires. 30 for paperback, 35 for hard. And they're all available, of course, in digital form, much cheaper in the race to the bottom of pricing. Right? So, any questions?
Cash or credit card?
Prefer cash. Any questions? No questions. All right, some of you saw that. I'll just tell you what it's from. 1952, Washington Post. It's just another way the paradigm is managed, and it's fun to explore this. That's what the book is about. There was an episode over Washington, D.C., where there were so many UFOs over the Capitol and the White House over 2 weekends, and so many jets scrambled from 3 nearby air bases, and so many headlines like this across the country, because it was still treated as news, which was part of the paradigm of distributing truth in those days. And they decided, when the agency and Air Force and so on said, we can't have this. We need to manage this, and the policies were instantiated because it was so alarming, so concerning, and above all because the Soviets could manipulate the phenomenon in several different ways to our detriment in terms of national security concerns that were genuine and real. But there were headlines like this. We have thousands of articles, thousands of headlines before the subject was so successfully debunked using media and entertainment, above all, to show that only idiots were interested in something as crazy as this. From the edge to the center. From the edge to the center. That's what this century is going to bring. The awareness that we are not alone. Everybody knows that, but you're going to know that you know it. And that's going to make all the difference. Okay, thank you.